1920s was the first age of greed, where the top 1% had nearly 75% of the wealth, leaving a paltry 25% to the bottom 99% of the people. The 1950s, 60s, 70s to 1980 was the age of fairness, where 75% of the wealth was retained by 99% of the people, and the remaining 25% of wealth was held by the rich 1%. From 1980 to 2016, in a gradual decline of fairness, or the second age of greed, the rich 1% have once again taken 75 plus percentage points of the wealth, leaving a slim less than 25% of the wealth to the remaining 99% of the people. 80 persons in the world own more wealth than 3.5 billion people. 40 of those persons are U.S. citizens. This first age of greed in the 1920s ended with the stock market crash of 1929, which sent us into the Depression. What's interesting about the 1920s, although it was the most greediest period in American history to that point, prior to that, go look at the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt from 1901 to 1908. This was the man who brought us the square deal. Square deal for the average man. Called it the square deal. And in that vein, he broke up all the trusts, the monopolies. Even with the trust busting and the monopoly busting, they still accumulated incredible amounts of wealth. I mean, they combined, they had 75% of the wealth of America, 1%. And unfortunately, this has all been turned backwards. Today, they're all becoming monopolies again. The trusts are building, the companies are buying companies, etc., etc., etc. And it's unfortunate. It could be because the antitrust laws aren't being enforced, the Sherman antitrust law, etc., etc. I don't know why, but the trusts and monopolies are back again. That's very worrisome. And then the bubble bursted, which gave way to our second greatest president, who brought us the New Deal, Social Security, and programs that hired all the unemployed people in America. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of unemployed people were put to work by this president. Who was in a wheelchair. And today, a person in a wheelchair probably could never obtain that office. That's disgraceful. And this man brought us Social Security, Medicare. He would have loved to give us universal health care. But the stingy rich people wouldn't go for it. No. We were so behind Europe in this that it's disgraceful. One note, Germany in the 1890s gave universal health care to their people. That's how far we are behind. Now, we prefer to go through the insurance companies. Well, that is really tragic and disgraceful for the richest country on earth. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt brought us out of the Great Depression. his presidency was from 1930 to 1945. Four-term president, only president with 4 terms. And that's because the people loved him. He had a regard for the general public like no other. He saw the mass unemployment, the disparity in income, etc., 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 the misery, and he was out to do something about it. So he created workers' programs. The government hired hundreds of thousands of people. The TVA was a great example. The Tennessee Valley Authority, they built dams and bridges, etc., employing hundreds of thousands of people, and that's just one of them. There was a conservation corps that went into the rural areas, and there was a 250,000 people working on that. And then the WPA, the Work Progress Administration, hired millions of people. And that's what we need again. We need them again. And he also had Social Security and FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, which insured depositors that their monies in banks were safe, and that if anything went wrong, the federal government would insure that. And the list goes on. And the regulations against banks and loan companies, he had strict regulations against them so they could never, ever again disturb our economy into a depression as they did in 1929. And these same regulations have been rolled back in the 80s and 90s by both Democrat and Republican presidents. They're rolling back the work of FDR. And it is disgraceful, because we're right now back to 1929. And in some aspects, I think we're even worse. There are 80 people that own more wealth than 3.5 billion people on this planet, and 40 of them are from the United States of America. What a disgrace. I mean, how much do you need? The 2 Roosevelt presidents, Teddy and Franklin, helped close the gap between the rich and the poor. Teddy, with the square deal, busted up the monopolies with antitrust laws. Franklin, with the New Deal, Social Security and strict banking restrictions, and massive public work projects that employed millions of unemployed. Here were 2 great presidents for the people. When comes such another? Going from the square deal to the New Deal to another raw deal. We definitely need another, like a Roosevelt.